Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong and I'm an engineering physics graduate who's been studying psychology and neuroscience for the last 10 years. And a lot of my work over the last 5 years in particular has been kind of blending physics and neuroscience and psychology. And in this video, what I'm going to be sharing is a very interesting view on social systems. And this kind of perspective is something that's starting to emerge in computational neuroscience. So it's kind of, a leading edge perspective in some ways. And specifically what I'm going to be talking about is information transfer between human beings. So in this video, I'm going to be talking a bunch about communication, um, and some of the underlying neuroscience and physics behind it. Okay, so in this video, we're going to be talking about the brain as an information processor. We're then going to be talking about social systems as networks of information processing. We're going to be talking about shared reality testing, which is essentially communication. And then we're going to talk about some of the limits on information transfer that exist, which include ego and shame and fear. Okay, so this is going to be a blend of physics and neuroscience and psychology, and to some extent sociology and so on. Okay, and I think once I lay out some of this information, I think you might start seeing the world in a new way, might start seeing relationships in a new way, and communication and so on. So yeah, let's just dive into it. So first, the brain as an information processor. Okay, so you probably are familiar with the metaphor of a brain as a computer. Okay, I think a lot of people are relatively familiar with that. And it turns out that this metaphor is actually quite accurate. Okay, so just as a little bit of history, back in the 1940s, some scientists at Bell Labs discovered that information is very closely related to the laws of physics. Okay, those were the early days of computing. Okay, and so they were studying things like signals and digital communication and so on. And they realized that information is related to entropy and specifically surprise. Okay, so if something likely happens, if something that we expect happens, it doesn't give us very much information. But if something that we aren't expecting happen, if something that we aren't expecting happens, the message is very informative. Okay, so information is related to entropy, which is a larger discussion, but it's related to surprise. Okay, so if something is new and interesting and relevant, it brings a lot of information. Okay. Now, based on this research, neuroscientists over the last 10, 20 years have realized that the brain functions as a surprise minimization machine. Okay, so the neuroscientist that is responsible for these discoveries is Carl Friston, and he's developed something called the free energy principle. And so basically, he's identified that the brain tries to minimize surprise. Okay, so if you have information coming in from your senses, okay, your brain is trying to minimize the amount of surprise that those sense information gives you. Okay, so let's say you're walking down the street and someone runs by in like a panda costume or something. It's surprising. Okay, and your brain is instinctively drawn to try to minimize that surprise. Why is this person running by in a panda costume? Like, what's going on, right? Um, and I'm sure, as you can imagine, um, minimizing surprise is a survival mechanism. Okay, so if you are, a tribes person 4,000 years ago and you're in the jungle, okay, and a tiger jumps out at you, Okay, that's very surprising. And surprise usually means something bad. Okay, so the brain is functions in such a way to minimize surprise and therefore maximize survival. Okay, because we basically want to know what's going on at any given time. We want to know what's happening in our environment. We don't want to be surprised. Okay, and so that's just kind of how the brain works. And a lot of this has to do with information science and some very complicated mathematics. Now, the interesting thing is that our brain is in a constant relationship with the environment. Okay, there's always sense information coming in. Okay, there's always information coming in through our senses. And our brain is always basically calculating what's going on and trying to figure out how to minimize surprise. Okay? And so this seems to be, based on the neuroscience, this seems to be one of the fundamental mechanisms that drives all brain activity. Okay, a lot of things that our brain does and a lot of the things that we do in our minds has to do with minimizing surprise. Okay? Now here's the really interesting thing. Okay? What happens when a bunch of brains get together in a group? Okay? When you have, say a group of people or even like two people who are in a relationship or something like that. Okay? What happens? And so this is where we get into the idea of social systems as networks. Okay? So if your brain is a computer, okay, and it's trying to minimize surprise, and you're in a group of people who also have computer brains and everyone is trying to minimize surprise, what happens? Okay? And this is where a lot of social mechanisms and so on, they can be traced back to the fundamental neuroscience. Okay? And this is actually something that's starting to happen in computational neuroscience. So Carl Friston and some other researchers are now looking at what happens when you have multiple brains in a group together. And they've identified that communication and language is a property of agents that seek evidence for generative models of their shared world. Okay, so basically, when you have a group of people all together, okay, we use language and communication in order to reduce surprise for everybody. Okay, we want to reduce surprise for everybody. Okay, because that's what everyone's trying to do individually. And so in groups, we do things in order to reduce surprise between each other and for the group as a whole. Okay, and I'll give you an example of this. Okay, let's say you're in a tribal village 4,000 years ago. Okay, and there's a tiger coming out of the woods towards the village. Okay, one person sees the tiger. Okay, and so what do? They run to the village and they say, hey everyone, there's a tiger coming. Okay, what they're doing fundamentally is reducing surprise for the whole group. Okay, yes, at some level, hearing that there's a tiger coming is a bit of a surprise in and of itself, but over the long term, it reduces surprise for the group because people are then able to update their model of reality, okay, and say, okay, there's something happening in the environment, we have to do something about it. Okay, so overall, communication between individuals and within groups serves to reduce surprise for the group. Okay? Now it's really, really interesting when you start thinking about things in this way, because you start to realize that most of society and most social phenomena are really just information transfer. Okay, so things like newspapers and television, it's information transfer. Social media, it's just information transfer. Posters and billboards and signs and memes, information transfer. Marketing, public relations, political campaigns, information transfer. Relationships, conversations, debates, arguments, information transfer. And all of these phenomena, all of these things that we do in groups, it serves to ideally reduce surprise in our own minds and reduce surprise for the whole group. Okay, what we're trying to do is essentially reduce surprise, understand our environment, make things more predictable. We want to get on the same page so we're not surprised by each other. Okay? That's basically a lot of what we're up to in society is information transfer. Okay? Now, one of the challenges of the human experience is that everyone has their own perspective. Okay, everyone has their own perspective on the world. People see things differently. Okay, and information transfer in such an environment can sometimes be challenging. And so a fundamental human skill, in terms of relationships and societies and so on, is something called shared reality testing. Okay? Now, what do I mean by shared reality testing? So, let's say you have two people. Both of them see the world in different ways. Okay? And the ways that they see the world are true for them. Okay, so reality testing or shared reality testing is those two people engaging in dialogue in order to sort out what is true for each other, what is true in general, okay? And coming to some kind of agreement or shared reality, okay? And this is kind of what Carl Friston's team has been looking at in terms of what they call federated influence. Okay, it's really just shared reality testing. Okay, I see the world this way, you see the world that way. Okay, let's talk about it, figure out what's going on, and come to a mutual agreement, a mutual understanding. Okay, and all of this is predicated on information transfer. Now, the thing about relationships of any kind, okay, and societies and so on, they are built on shared reality. Okay, and what does shared reality mean? It means that I hold space for your perspective. You hold space for my perspective. We share our perspectives, we listen to each other, and we draw reasonable conclusions from all of the facts that are available. Okay? Now, a key part of reality testing and shared reality testing is being fair. Okay? And what does it mean to be fair or fair-minded? Okay? It means that we have to validate things that are subjectively true for the other person, and we also have to accept things that are objectively true. Okay? So for example, let's say two people are in a relationship. Okay, a friendship or a romantic relationship or something, right? One person says or does something that triggers the other person, right? Maybe the other person has some trauma or whatever. It reminds them of past things. And it's an accident. They say or do something that triggers something, and it's a really deep reaction. Okay? Now, in that kind of situation, okay, the person who does something that's triggering is responsible for validating the subjective experience of the other person. Okay, they're responsible for validating and say, hey, you know what? I totally see how what I said made you feel a certain kind of way. I'm really sorry. I can see how that made you feel the way that you feel. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do it again, you know? And the thing is, like, you can validate without necessarily accepting that something is objectively true. Okay, because let's say you say something and it triggers someone else, and they come back at you and say, "You're a bad person, you hate me," whatever, right? You don't necessarily need to accept that as objectively true, but you do need to validate their subjective experience. Okay, so it can be, and that this can be a challenging line to walk, right? Like, how much do you validate without accepting, and so on, right? Now it's also interesting because let's say that, person A says or does something that triggers person B. Okay? Person B is actually responsible for the trigger and the trauma that comes up. They are responsible for reality testing and saying, "Hey, did you mean to hurt me?" Right? Are you actually a bad person or whatever? Or was this like an accident, and so on? Okay? So person A in this situation is responsible for validating. Okay? Person B is responsible for reality testing and accepting that, like, you know what, maybe that thing that you said to me, you didn't mean it in the way that I took it, and so on. Okay? So shared reality is actually very, very, very challenging. Okay? Because every single person has their own perspective on the world. Everyone has their own traumas, their own triggers, their own preferences, their own feelings. Okay? And so overcoming all of those things to get to a shared reality is the essence of the human experience. Okay? It's the root of basically all interpersonal difficulties, you know? Is understanding where the other person is coming from, reality testing, figuring out, what's actually happening, and getting on the same page. Okay, this is like the challenges of doing this are basically the root of all interpersonal conflict. Okay? So to build on that a little bit, I would argue that from the perspective of information theory and neuroscience, all conflict is a lack of shared reality. Okay? All conflict is based on people not holding space for other people's perspectives. People not properly understanding why someone thinks or feels the way that they do. People refusing to be reasonable when presented with information that challenges their preferences. And people refusing to validate someone's subjective reality or to accept objective reality. Okay? Those four things seem to be the root of all interpersonal conflict. And it all comes down to information transfer and information processing. Okay? It all comes down to information transfer and information processing. Okay? Now, the root of these issues, seems to be three things. Okay? When someone else's perspective threatens your view of the world, it can be perceived as a threat. Okay? Because if someone's perspective is very different from your own, it creates a bunch of surprise initially. Okay? It can be very surprising to learn how someone else views the world. And remember, your brain is trying to minimize surprise. Okay? So it can be very, very tempting to dismiss someone else's perspective because it threatens your view of the world. Your brain is trying to minimize surprise. Someone comes in with a perspective that seems out of left field, and it's like, no, like, I don't have time for that, or that's too challenging. I don't have time to deal with that. I don't want to think about it, whatever. Okay? So that's one root of conflict. The second root of conflict is when someone else's perspective threatens your view of yourself. which is also perceived as a threat. Okay? So let's say you're going through the world, right, and doing your thing, and someone comes up to you and says, hey, something that you said or did hurt me. Okay? That can be very, very challenging, because what you're getting is you're getting a surprise from your environment. Okay? And that surprise requires you to think about yourself and who you think you are. Okay? And that can be very, very challenging. It can be very, very challenging. Because you might discover, right, that maybe you're not as good of a person as you thought you were. Maybe you aren't as responsible as you thought you were. Okay, maybe whatever, right? And then you have to think about that and update your own understanding of yourself. Okay? A lot of people don't like doing this. A lot of people don't like doing this because it's very painful, right? It's very painful to come to a shared reality, okay? Which includes maybe you being at fault for causing intentional or unintentional harm, okay? It creates, a lot of negative feelings and so on. It can be very challenging. Okay, and the third root of conflict is when someone else's perspective threatens your preferences or interests, which can be perceived as an inconvenience. Okay, so let's say you're a company and you want to build a factory. Okay, and there's protests or whatever because people say, hey, the factory is going to ruin the lake, or it's going to ruin the environment, or whatever. Okay, it's perceived as an inconvenience. It's like, we're trying to make money, we're trying to make a living, and you're over here talking about the trees and the water, right? Like, who are you? Like, get out of my way, right? And so those kinds of things, as you can imagine, create a lot of social conflict in a group sense, okay? Because societies and countries and cities and so on, they're filled with different groups of people who have different interests. And those interests are sometimes and often colliding with one another, okay? And so one of the challenges of societies in general is figuring out how to exist harmoniously when different groups of people have different interests. Okay, and in our world currently, political conflicts are really big, like conservatives versus liberals. And, it's really challenging, right? Because the liberals have one worldview, which is very, very different from conservatives, right? And so the challenge is, how do we exist harmoniously as a group? Okay? And really, it comes down to shared reality testing. It comes down to shared reality testing. Okay? Which is something that's really, really challenging in, our current world, because things are so polarized. Okay? It would mean two people or groups of people sitting down, genuinely understanding each other's perspectives, okay, looking at what is objectively true, okay, and then adjusting their perspectives to fit what is objectively true, okay, as opposed to just the subjective perspectives, okay? And typically in any conflict, both sides have to adjust their perspective, okay? Now the challenge is this. Either you deal with surprise up front and you try to ignore other perspectives and quash them or whatever. Either you ignore it up front, okay, and minimize it in the short term, which creates conflict, or you take a more harmonious route and engage in shared reality testing and minimize surprise in the long term, okay, which is what creates social cohesion. Okay, so you're either minimizing surprise up front, creating long-term conflict, or you're engaging in the difficult work of information transfer, shared reality testing, okay, federated influence. You're engaging in that difficult work to develop a shared reality, okay, which minimizes conflict over the long term. So that's basically, you know, most of what I wanted to talk about. A lot of social phenomena, a lot of conflict, a lot of social anything, okay, can be understood from the perspective of information transfer. Okay? So just to recap briefly, your brain tries to minimize surprise. Okay? And as a group or in relationships with other people in general, we are trying to minimize surprise together. Okay? We're all trying to minimize surprise together. Okay? We all want to get on the same page. But the challenge of getting on the same page means accepting surprise up front. Okay, it means that when you're sharing perspectives and transferring information with other people, you're going to hear things that are surprising. And you need to be able to get over that initial surprise, engage in shared reality testing, okay, so you can reach long-term cohesion. And this seems to be one of the essential challenges of the human experience. Okay, and it all comes down to neuroscience and in some cases physics. Okay? Everything is essentially an information transfer problem and an information processing problem. Okay? Now, if we're talking about information transfer, okay, in some sense, there's a mathematical angle to this. Okay, in some sense, there's a mathematical angle because the things that I'm saying have a certain mathematical quality to them in the sense that I'm communicating a quantity of information. I'm communicating a quantity of information. For example, I'm speaking at about 100 to 200 words per minute. Okay, I'm speaking at words per minute. So you can actually quantify how much information I'm sharing with you, okay, in terms of like words per minute. So as a physicist, as an engineering graduate, and so on, one of the things that I'm drawn to is what are the limits of information transfer? Okay, if we're in a group and we're all sharing information with each other, what are the limits? Okay, what either increases or decreases our ability to do shared reality testing? Okay, what increases or decreases our ability? And there's probably a lot of different factors, but you know, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, 3 of them are ego, shame, and fear. Okay, so ego. Ego is basically being too attached to your own perspective, not being willing to entertain the surprising perspectives that other people might have. Okay? Either because it challenges how you view the world, or it challenges how you view yourself, or whatever. Ego, right? Being too attached to your own perspective. It makes it very difficult to do shared reality testing. Because it's either me, my perspective dominates, or it's your perspective dominates me. That's what ego does to people. It creates power games, right? Perspectives, instead of being shared, reality tested, and harmonized, it becomes a battle. Okay, and that's what ego does. Now the second thing is shame. And this is tough. Shame is really tough. Because as you move through the world, you're going to learn things that challenge your view of yourself. Okay? And I'll give you one example, okay? Let's say it's 1946 and you are a resident of Berlin. Okay? You're a resident of Berlin living in Germany. Okay? And you discover in 1946 what had been happening under the Nazi regime. And let's say that you voted for the Nazi regime and you were supporting them the whole way. And you didn't necessarily know some of the things that they were up to. Okay? And you get that information. You read it in the newspapers or whatever. Okay? It's really challenging. It's really challenging because then you have to ask yourself, you know, how did I miss this? How did I miss this? How did I get caught up in this whole thing? Right? What does that mean about me? Right? What does that mean about the things that I need to improve? And so on. And, you know, I'd have to do a bit more reading on this, but even after, you know, the Holocaust became public awareness and so on, a lot of people were kind of in a form of denial about it. Right? And it's because of shame. It's because of shame. And so shame makes it difficult to engage in shared reality testing. Okay? And this is especially true in interpersonal relationships, and especially romantic relationships. Okay? Because if you do something that unintentionally hurts your partner, and they come back to you and they say, hey, this hurt me. Like, how could you do this to me? If you really cared, you wouldn't have done this even by accident. Okay? It triggers shame. And unfortunately, in friendships, romantic relationships, and even in group relationships and societies, people will often become defensive. Okay, they'll often become defensive, or they'll engage in, you know, well, like, you did this to me and blah, 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 right? And it's to avoid shame. It's to avoid shame. And so shame prevents shared reality testing. It prevents us from being able to validate what is subjectively true for the other person, and it prevents us from being able to accept things that are objectively true. You know, like, yeah, you know what? Like, I shouldn't have said that thing. I shouldn't have done that thing. I need to be more careful with my words and so on. Like, I'm sorry, right? And then actually doing the work to change and improve. So shame is a big one, okay? It prevents shared reality testing, and it limits information transfer. And it's because it limits your capacity to process information. Okay? Now the third thing is fear. The third thing is fear. Okay? Sometimes the information that we get from other people is surprising. And it's surprising in ways that make us afraid. Okay? And over the last 15 years, one of my roles, unintentionally or intentionally, has been truth teller. Okay, and I'll give you one example of this, okay? So during the pandemic, I became aware of some information about certain policies that were being enacted in Canada. Okay, and I was very concerned by some of the numbers and statistics that I was seeing from Ontario's official data sets. I attempted to contact Hamilton Public Health, the main authorities in my city. I attempted to get in contact with the ethicist of a main hospital network in our city. And I eventually did make contact with those people after a lot of trying and so on. And the ethicist in particular, he was part of a group that was overseeing some of the policies, that had to do with certain things, right? And I presented to him the data and I said, this is a problem, right? The risk benefit is not justifiable when it comes to children. By your own math, by your own data. It's not justifiable. And his response was basically, don't worry about things that you can't control. Now, if I'm empathizing with him, right? He's the ethicist of a hospital network. Ethics is in his job title. He was also part of, a board of people working at the provincial level. And he was presented with information that what he was doing was not ethically justifiable. Or at least there were significant enough concerns that they needed to drastically change their policies. Okay? If you are someone in his position and you get that kind of information and you can't deny it, which he wasn't able to, it creates fear. Okay, it creates fear because it's like, if I take this information and I try to tell it to my colleagues or I try to speak up about it or whatever, I'm going to lose my job. People are going to say that, I'm crazy or whatever, right? And so sometimes the information that we get makes us afraid because it implies a certain reality that we are afraid to deal with. Okay? And I've seen this in other cases too. Just to give you an example, back before I was an independent researcher, I was doing research at a university. And through my research, I discovered that there was someone who was harming students, female students specifically. And so I brought this information to, the relevant people. And I became an independent researcher. I was no longer doing research at the university. And why? Because being confronted with that kind of information creates fear, right? How is this going to look for the university? How is this going to look for us? Blah, 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 right? And so I became an independent researcher. So that's fear, fear in action. Okay, so ego, shame, and fear are three of the things that limit information transfer, limit information processing, and limit shared reality testing. Now, the final thing I'm going to mention is this. Okay? One of the elements of Carl Friston's free energy principle, one of the elements that he kind of uncovered through the neuroscience and the physics and the mathematics, is he discovered that when the brain receives information that is surprising, the brain only has two options: to either change itself to accommodate the new information, or to change the environment and get rid of the surprise. Okay? And one is not always better than the other. Okay? Like, sometimes a surprise is objectively bad and you want to change the environment to get rid of the surprise. Okay? Like, let's say your car is malfunctioning and it's surprising. You fix the car, right? So sometimes changing the environment is the right approach. However, most social problems, most interpersonal problems, most problems in relationships happen because people are unwilling to change themselves. They are unwilling to change themselves. And they would rather change the environment. And sometimes that means villainizing somebody, firing them, cutting them off, right? It can even mean genocide or war, right? Because it's like, I am so unwilling to understand your perspective or even hear it that I have to kill you, right? And so I would argue that from the perspective of neuroscience, physics, information transfer, the biggest challenge that we face as human beings individually and as societies is that we are unwilling to update ourselves and change ourselves in response to the information that we're getting. And to be honest, one of the reasons that I've been studying these things at this level is because it makes me so sad. It makes me so sad. It makes me so sad that ego, fear, and shame prevent us from getting along. Because, for me personally, I've lived part of my life as, a scientist and an atheist liberal. I'm now a religious conservative. And I've walked a bunch of different paths and spent time with a bunch of different groups. Okay? I used to be an LGBT activist. Obviously, I'm a religious conservative now, but my time in LGBT world, right? I understand where they're coming from. I understand where they're coming from. And I've spent some time with the Hoteps, who are a group of Black American scholars. And I spent enough time with them and listened to them enough to understand where they're coming from on certain racial issues. And I spent a lot of time being friends with women and supporting women, sometimes through really difficult circumstances. And I understand where they're coming from. And one thing that makes me really sad is that when I move through the world and I encounter people who are either prejudiced or insensitive, I just see it as a failure of information transfer and information processing. It's just people who aren't willing to change and adjust their perspectives to accommodate the existence of other people. And I'll give you an example, right? There was a controversy last year, I think 2 years ago, where women were asked, would you rather be alone in the woods with a man or a bear? And a lot of them said a bear. And a lot of men were very offended by that. And why were they offended? Why was it a controversy? Because it triggers shame. Triggers shame. Because that kind of information is surprising. It's very surprising. I think it surprised a lot of guys, right? And there are only two options. From the brain's perspective, there are only two options. One is to argue and deny and defend and attack women and say women are being hysterical or whatever. Changing the environment, forcing the environment to be what you want it to be to get rid of surprise. And the second option is to take this information and say, okay, this is surprising that a lot of women would say this, right? We need to validate what is subjectively true. Okay, we need to validate what is subjectively true without necessarily accepting things that are not objectively true, right? And yeah, it's just, I think it's challenging for a lot of guys to understand the level of fear that exists. You know? And what we have fundamentally is a lack of shared reality testing. It's a lack of shared reality testing. Okay? It's a failure to process the information that you're being given. And like, I'll be honest, you know, this is a bit of a tangent, I guess, but like, I've seen a number of clips on the Whatever podcast where women are talking about the fear that they have and also some resentment that they have towards men. And there's one guy, I think his name is Andrew Wilson or something. And one of his favorite arguments is to tell women, like, well, if men wanted to dominate and enslave you, we could, and we're not, so that means we're benevolent. Right? Which is the complete wrong approach. Okay, it's a complete failure to understand the other person's perspective. Because if someone comes to you, like, let's say, you know, in that situation, the women are coming to him and basically saying, we're afraid. We're afraid. And he's responding with, well, I could hurt you if I wanted to, and I'm not, so you shouldn't be afraid. That's crazy to me. It's crazy to me. Right? Like, I can't imagine if someone comes to me and tells me that they're afraid, responding with basically intimidation and reminding them essentially that they do have reason to be afraid, but they're just being unreasonable about it. It's a failure of shared reality testing. Okay? And so when I look at what's happening in Western society, I just see a failure of shared reality testing between individuals and groups and so on. Okay, like, I don't think the conservative types really understand where the liberals are coming from. And I don't think the liberal types really understand where the conservatives are coming from. Okay, and men don't understand where women are coming from. Women don't understand where men are coming from. No one understands where anyone is coming from. Okay, and everyone is talking at each other. And not even at each other. People are talking to their own groups on social media. Right? But no one is really sitting down and having the tough conversations, dealing with the surprise up front in order to reach harmony and lower surprise over the long term. That's really what's happening, is everyone is so surprised and shocked at how other people view the world that they're trying to minimize the surprise by controlling their environment and winning debates and winning elections and suppressing the other group and controlling the narrative, right? Controlling the narrative is what people say, right? And what is controlling the narrative? Minimizing surprise by controlling the environment. And really, when you think about friendships, relationships, social groups, anything like that, you can't really control the narrative because the narrative is shared. The narrative is shared. We are all co-creating a narrative. Our brains are all computers. We are just exchanging information, right? And if you try to control the narrative, that's tyranny. Like, yes, you can share what is true for you, but really, in a federated influence situation or a shared reality testing situation, no one can control the narrative. It's not fair. It's not fair. So, I've been talking for 51 minutes. This was way longer of a video than I expected to make, but hopefully I helped show that a lot of things that we don't realize are connected to neuroscience and physics are. Okay? Everything that we're dealing with in society right now, all of our social problems, all of our relationship problems, it comes down to information transfer, information processing, and shared reality testing. Everything else is downstream of those things. And the reality is that all of the problems that we're facing, as a species, as a society, whatever, the problems are a lot easier to solve than we realize. And we solve these things through communication. And not just communication, but also acceptance of other people's perspectives and other people's realities and experiences. We solve these things by creating room in our minds and our hearts for the other person. And it's all just an information transfer, information processing problem, And, as you could tell, like, this stuff kind of makes me sad because as a physicist, as an engineer, the solutions anyway, are so simple in theory. But because we're dealing with human emotions like shame and fear, it can become very, very complex. So that's what I had to share. I plan on talking about this topic more on my channel. So if you liked this, like and subscribe for more. There's more layers to this. There's more layers to this. This is just the surface of the information transfer thing. And already on my channel, if you look at some of the videos I have on my Kabbalah playlist, you'll see that a lot of things that are talked about in Kabbalah also fall into information transfer. It's all just information transfer. And, our ability to change ourselves and update our perspectives based on what we're receiving from the environment, that's the essence of life. So thank you very much for your time. If you watched all of this, thank you very, very much, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you again, and yeah, hope to see you again on my channel.